All right, just tell me. Okay, you're recording?
Yep.
All right. Oh. So, obviously, welcome to the lecture on the presidential race. What's going to happen is I'll give the first half of this presentation and then hop over to the Middle East where I'll give the second half of that presentation. So I'm running double duty. I'll be actually talking about the primaries and how the primary process played out this year. And then Steve's going to talk a bit more about the general, some Senate, House elections, et cetera, stuff like that. Okay? So let's get started with the 2020 presidential race. But before we get into the specifics in this year, we're going to have to go into detail of like why this 2020 primary was kind of interesting, okay? First and foremost, because there was just a ton of different candidates, okay? Like on the Democratic side, there were like, 25, 26 different candidates running, okay? And there's a large number of candidates on a field regardless. We saw this year with the Democratic primary field, but we also saw it in 2016 on the Republican side where there were like, once again, 16 pushing 20 candidates on the Republican side, right? So when you have a large number of candidates, what ends up happening is that news networks and the media needs to find out who to cover. And they largely decide who to cover based on a personality-driven campaign. So whoever is the most whichever candidate brings the most oomph to their ratings and stuff like that, they're going to focus on the candidate's personal qualities rather than their policy positions or experiences. And that's really why in 2016, Trump, such a novelty, no one really knew what to make of him. He was coming in, talking loud, talking smack. The media instantly focused on him. And then in 2020 on the Democratic side, there were a lot of young, good candidates, right? Like Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke, really compelling candidates. But what happened was that the media didn't necessarily know who to focus on with them, and they ended up focusing on kind of the big personality of Bernie Sanders and the circus surrounding Joe Biden and stuff like that. They really focus on the candidate's personal qualities, like Joe Biden's old, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and those ideas and formed a personality-driven extremism. Primaries already have a dividing effect. They already appeal to the more hardcore supporters of the party because more hardcore Democrats vote in the Democratic Party, more hardcore Republicans vote in the Republican primary. I mean, it's just pretty. Oh, am I cutting out? Let me see.
Is he cutting out for anyone else?
Yeah, he is.
Okay.
Let me. One sec.
It's not too bad, but it's like a bit once in a while.
Okay, I'm in chat again if I keep cutting out. Am I fine now, at least?
Yeah, it seems like you're
Did that?
pretty good.
Okay. I think it was just like a quick connection issue. Like my packet, like there might have been a bit of packet loss or something. But yeah, basically in primaries, we generally appeal to the ends of the spectrum, right? Hardcore Democrats tend to be more liberal. Hardcore Republicans tend to be more conservative. And this is just a feature of primaries in general, but is also a feature of primaries with a large number of candidates. And finally, there's a horse race mentality where voters follow opinion poll numbers to see who's winning rather than policy positions. Yeah, so like in the early primary, one candidate or two candidates are doing really well and they're really leading in the polls. Like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders were really high poll numbers early on. I mean, so was Warren. Pete was like below. Most of the media attention, most of the coverage is focused on who's winning because there's just so many people there that the media have to divide their attention somehow. And they just do that based on the polls. Now, that's a general effect of the primaries. And obviously, before I go further, just giving a quick definition, if people don't know what a primary is, it's just that like before the general election of any position, so whether it's the presidency, Congress seats, Senate seats, etc., people within each party duke it out. Okay, so different Democrats will duke it out to get that nomination. It's the same for the presidency all the way down. Right. So, and before we go deeper into the analysis of this specific year, I'm going to give you a few tips for successful election speeches in general. So like if you need to answer a question about an election, what should you be doing? First of all, you should reference specific poll numbers. And this is actually great because if you read a lot of polls or a wide variety of polls, you can really find just a lot of different numbers. Polls vary, and as long as the pollster's semi-credible, you can find about any poll to fit your narrative. So if you do a lot of reading, you can reference specific poll numbers that make your speech look stronger. Even if they're an outlier, you don't really have to mention that. And if the judge or your cross-exer doesn't call you on it, you're home free. Should reference specific voter demographics. Yes. For example, if you're talking about the Democratic primary, and you don't talk about how integral Black voters are to the Democratic primary strategy, you're doing something wrong, right? Or when you're talking about this year's general, you should be making a reference to 65-year and older white voters, right? Older white voters who might be turning away from Trump towards Biden. These are voter demographics that you should be mentioning when you're talking about elections. They often require explicit comparisons between candidates. Which candidate is most likely to win the presidential nomination? Yeah. And when you get asked to make comparisons, make comparisons. If your answer to which candidate is most likely to win is Joe Biden, you should make comparisons to why Joe Biden is able to win rather than Amy Klobuchar or something like that, right? If you just say that Joe Biden will win because he's moderate and then don't compare him to other moderate candidates, you're not doing a good job of proving that. Yeah, and comparisons you should effectively make at your B and C subpoints, in my opinion. That's correct. And then focus on actions instead of adjectives. Right. If you have a logical jump, a logical leap, something like that, having hard evidence and hard statistics, hard facts to back that up is much more effective. For example, Donald Trump has advocated for mass deportation of undocumented immigrants instead of just saying he has extremist views. So that's really, really important. And these tips should be present in every single election speech you have. Now, what else can you incorporate into a speech about elections? Well, there are specific stats as far as campaigns go that make them successful or not very successful. First one that has some eye-popping numbers, fundraising, right? You always see numbers like Michael Bloomberg has so much money on hand, but he's only getting it from his, or oh my God, Bernie Sanders they're all coming from small donors, right? Fundraising, always in the news. And there's a great piece out there by 538 that examines the correlation between money on hand in campaigns and fundraising and actually winning the campaign. That's a piece that everybody should read in Extemper because you can make more sense of these fundraising numbers. Just look up 538 money and elections. Wait, let me look it up. 538 money wins elections. It's a piece that pops up from September 10th, 2018, how money affects elections. I would read it. It's it's not that long at all, but it's really, really important to understand why fundraising matters. Second, name recognition. There's a theory on name recognition that you can really use in your speech, especially through a theory application impact substructure, right? And that theory is that name recognition is good, but if you have high name recognition but still low poll numbers, it's not good, right? Because if the entire voter base already knows who you are and you're still polling low, that's not good. On the contrary, though, if you have low name recognition and still have a decent amount in the polls, you can perhaps extrapolate that once more people get to know you, more people will get to they'll actually vote for you. So there's a theory that name recognition, but but name recognition, bad poll numbers is bad. And that's a really, really simple theory, but it's one that you can use. Political baggage, right? There was that whole thing. Oh, I might be cutting out again. I'm just going to pause for a second because my internet's a bit spotty. Okay, should be better. But political baggage, there's this whole thing earlier this election cycle where Joe Biden was a racist, Kamala Harris was a cop, right? Stuff that you've done in your past that may make it harder for people to vote for you. Ability to unify the party and get endorsements. Endorsements are actually super important. As we will see in our analysis of this year specifically, endorsements really change the game. And unifying the party means building a coalition. So if you want to win the Democratic primary, you better be able to unify the party between everyone under their tent, right? Liberals, union workers, progressives, all demographics, Asian voters, Black voters, white voters, college educated, non-college educated. Every single one of those has a place in some part in the Democratic Party, right? You need to be able to unify them. And this goes out with the ability to reach out to moderates, independents, and third-party voters in the general. Strength of the economy. If the economy is good, it's good for the incumbent. If the economy is bad, bad for the incumbent. That's another theory that you can use, and that generally holds true. Media. In 2016, Trump won largely because the media narrative was just surrounding him the whole time. He got more name recognition. He got more attention. Media and the media narrative is very important. Largely, online narrative helped shape the fact that Bernie was the main contender. Media was focusing on Bernie being the main contender, and boom, he rose above all the other progressives. But then the media suddenly shifted to how can we stop Bernie Sanders? And there we go. Elevated Michael Bloomberg, elevated Joe Biden, and Joe Biden came out on top, right? Now, the reason momentum/debate performance is in this sarcastic font is because, it really doesn't matter. Momentum can shift with a snap of the fingers. Debate performance is neither here nor there. It's really just, these are more subjective things. And finally, success with key demographics. One of the biggest reasons why Joe Biden won this year was because he overperformed and kept solid with the Black voters in the Democratic Party. That's very, very important. So let's talk primaries, and let's talk the 2020 primaries. So this is just something that I want you guys to see because it just shows that things in the primary can change in a matter of days, really. Days, in a matter of weeks, in a matter of 1 week. This prediction at my state tournament final round I gave in February, talking about why the progressive cause was still going to win the primary. I was saying that Bernie was surely going to win the primary. This was on the day of the Nevada caucuses, it was a caucus, the Nevada caucuses. It wasn't a primary. And I was talking about how Bernie was going to win. And just 1 week later, Biden wins South Carolina and wins the whole thing. So let's take a look at what I said. Minor, which we'll see.
So when we come back to today's question, will the apparent rift between Warren impact the progressive cause in the Democratic presidential primary? The answer, simply put, is no. First, Bernie has already consolidated support. Second, it actually advanced progressive feminism. And finally, the moderates can't put up a capable challenge. So even though Warren and Sanders had 100% real beef, it looks like the burger of the Democratic primary is still the progressives to eat.
Okay. So other than that speech just being completely wrong, what we have to note is that at the time, that speech was right. That speech won me state because it was completely right at the time. Even though in hindsight, it was the worst prediction in the history of predictions maybe ever. At the time, Bernie was going to win. Bernie was going to win. The progressives were going to win. The moderates were stumbling all over themselves. This was in late February, right before Joe Biden kicked on and won everything. And that's why primaries are so volatile, because stuff can change at really any time. And it starts really with the size of the field and the differing size of the Democratic field. So once again, the basics of primaries before general election, which is generally in November, primary date by state. And in presidential years, Iowa and New Hampshire are always first. That means that throughout the primary leading up to the actual election year, most candidates focus their time in the early states: Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. The problem with this is that most media attention does not focus on Nevada and South Carolina until Iowa and New Hampshire are already over. And that's a problem because Iowa and New Hampshire really set the narrative, right? They're both majority white states with very little minority presence. And that means that when Bernie and Pete Buttigieg overperform in Iowa and New Hampshire, that's what the media is focusing on. But there is really no chance for the backbone of the Democratic Party, minorities, black voters, to get a say until Nevada and South Carolina, right? So it really skews the narrative. And that's part of the reason why I was so wrong, because the early election results at that time saw Joe Biden falling very flat. So that's one of the reasons why people are calling for the primary calendar to be revised. But as of now, it's still Iowa and New Hampshire first. So the basics in 2020. In 2020, Trump was uncontested on the Republican side, right? Except for like two quasi-challenges from Bill Weld and Joe Walsh, bids that got nowhere because Republicans are still unified around the president. The Democrats, however, were a mess. While the presidential primaries are essentially over, the congressional primaries are ongoing. And the presidential primary this year is one for the history books. All of these people at one point president candidates on the Democratic side, and I'm not even including all of them. Just gonna pause for a second because the internet connection message just showed up on my screen again. But now, still missing from this picture, there is Tom Steyer here. At least I don't think. There is no Michael Bloomberg. There is no Deval Patrick. But there is Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, Michael Bennet, Mike Gravel, Beto O'Rourke, Tulsi Gabbard, John Delaney, Eric Swalwell, Tim Ryan, Seth Moulton, that's a name I haven't heard in a while, Julian Castro, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, John Hickenlooper, Jay Inslee, Andrew Yang, Marianne Williamson, Wayne Messam, Steve Bullock, and Bill de Blasio. I'm still shook that Tulsi Gabbard dropped out. I was so sure she would win. Yeah, maybe if you were a Republican, you were counting on Tulsi Gabbard to win. But yeah, so many candidates on the Democratic side. There are 24 right here, 27 at least, because I didn't even mention 3 of them. It was a mess, right? But who ended up winning? The two that ended up at the end of the whole thing were the people we knew in the first place, Bernie and Joe Biden, right? There was so much talk going around with the most diverse space of candidates in the history of the Democratic Party. We got an Asian dude. We got multiple Asian dudes. We got an Asian woman. We got people of all genders, nationalities, creeds, right? Holy moly. Well, not nationalities. They're all American, but all races, stuff like that. But no, it was still Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. And there's a reason for that. Name recognition, building coalitions. These newcomers, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Andrew Yang, they either A, couldn't build a coalition fast enough, B, only appealed to like one specific subset of supporters, or C, did not have like clear ideological grounding. They were either fluctuating between being a moderate and progressive, right? And then the other ones were just clones of other candidates. Steve Bullock essentially was Joe Biden, but younger. Same with Tim Ryan, same with Seth Moulton, same with John Delaney, right? And these other candidates all struggled with something. So let's analyze how this primary actually played out and what we can learn from it. How did we go from all of that to I'm riding with Biden, to Biden taking control of the Democratic Party as a 78-year-old dude with multiple about him. What is your ideal candidate to take on Donald Trump? Not a single one would have argued for Joe Biden. And yet, we ended up with Biden. And this is largely because A, like, he occupies the moderate lane with the most effectiveness and the most name recognition, but B, because like many people might not have had Biden as their first choice, but they certainly didn't want Bernie, right? So when it was Biden versus Bernie, Biden took up most of those votes. Most of it was that he weathered the early storm of the primaries and his attacks, largely because he had high name recognition, high support among minority communities, and was occupying that moderate lane. So let's talk about the timeline of events that actually got us up to this point. Okay, from that 24 candidate horse race on the eve of the Iowa caucuses, the day before February 3rd, there were still a few major players left. The rest had all dropped out. Biden, Sanders, Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and then, of course, we got the minor players of Andrew Yang, Tom Steyer, who for some reason are still in the race, even though they have no real path to victory. Andrew Yang's whole gimmick, whole shtick was very, very effective at the point of UBI to the rest of the nation, but it was never really clear that he could create a coalition past UBI or appeal to people who didn't buy into what seemed at the time was a radical proposal, right? Of course, now we see with the CARES Act, COVID, that Yang was really ahead of his time. And maybe if the election had been pushed back a few months, Yang would have done much better. But at the time, Yang's big failure was that he really was not able to expand the coalition and that his idea didn't catch on fast enough. But now more and more people might think that it's a good idea, and he looks to be a big player in politics in the years to come. Yang, unfortunate timing, little name recognition, did way better than expected. Steyer was more of an ego trip. He just had a ton of money and was putting a ton of it into his campaign. Same with Bloomberg, but Bloomberg was doing that to a much more high extent. Steyer was is only worth like a couple $1 billion, which only worth a couple $1 billion. Bloomberg, on the other hand, $50 billion, ridiculous. But he had a different strategy. He was planning to skip the first 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, and go for a more unconventional strategy where on March 3rd, Super Tuesday, he would spend all his money there and try to win delegates there. And the hype around Bloomberg got so high online and in the media that people were not even considering Biden as an option anymore. It was either going to be Sanders or Bloomberg. Like their campaign, Bloomberg's campaign was even saying that it was going to be a battle between Sanders and Bloomberg, which on the back of it was ridiculous because he had not won any votes at that point. But, you know, people were scared that Bernie was going to win, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these major players. And on February 3rd, we get the first rumble. Buttigieg wins Iowa. It's a contested decision. Sanders gets second. He wins more of the vote, but Pete gets more of the delegates in kind of a mini electoral college situation. So Pete wins Iowa. Kind of a shock to a lot of people. Twitter that night was crazy. They were like, how did Pete win? I can't believe Pete won. Oh my God. Because Pete, even though he's young, millennials, Gen Z don't like Pete Buttigieg. The reason for that is wide varied. There are a lot of good magazine articles on why young people don't like Pete. People just don't like Pete. Now, I'm going to say that I love Pete. I was actually a delegate candidate for Pete. Unfortunately, he before he could in Illinois, but I was throughout this process. Okay, the Elizabeth Warren type Democrat, right? So Sanders gets second there, and on February 11th, New Hampshire, Sanders wins and Buttigieg gets second. Now you might be thinking, hold up. With these results, why was the talk all around Bloomberg and Biden? Why wasn't anyone talking about Pete as an alternative? Why wasn't anyone talking about Pete being that moderate placeholder? There was more buzz about about Amy Klobuchar, who came in third, then Pete, who came in second, right? So the reason why Pete and really Klobuchar didn't make waves past New Hampshire was because they fell into the trap of prioritizing Iowa and New Hampshire, which was majority white. They didn't make a coalition. They didn't have enough voters of color. They didn't have enough Black support. They were really focusing on the white support. So people did not count on Pete and Amy Klobuchar to make an impact past New Hampshire. And they were correct, okay? They were correct. On February 22nd, which was the day I gave that ill-fated speech, Sanders routes Nevada. And this is really, really important because Nevada is the first diverse state in the primary. They've got a very high Hispanic minority and just more diversity than Iowa and New Hampshire put together, right? Sanders dominates something like 40-something% of the vote in a field with still like 6 or 7 candidates. It's ridiculous. And at this point, people are just saying Bernie's going to win. Because look, Joe Biden was an afterthought. In Iowa and New Hampshire, he placed 3rd and 4th or something like that, right? Something really, really weak. So he was just an afterthought at this point. And moderates are really panicking because they do not want Bernie to win. And it's easy to see why. Bernie, once again, does not have a big coalition, focuses on the progressives. It's really just not a good look for the Democratic Party if Bernie routes through. So that's where they start seriously talking about Bloomberg and how he can pull through, since Biden, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar just don't have momentum. They don't seem to have a coalition. But Biden does have a coalition. On February 29th, Biden routes South Carolina. It's a huge, huge victory. And the big part of this was one endorsement. Jim Clyburn, South Carolina congressman, drops the big endorsement the Thursday or the Friday before. That endorsement won the primary. That endorsement could well change the course of our country's history because Biden routes South Carolina. Jim Clyburn, one of the most trusted members of the Black community, endorses Joe Biden. After sitting on an endorsement for months and months, he routes South Carolina, dominates. And then boom, March 1st and 2nd, Buttigieg and Klobuchar drop out. Even though they literally might even have like the similar number or even more delegates than Biden, they realize they can't build a coalition. Biden can. They both drop out, endorse Biden. And on March 3rd, Super Tuesday, it's a showdown between Biden, Sanders, and Bloomberg, where Bloomberg is still in the race because his whole strategy was Super Tuesday. Biden has new momentum, and this is where the momentum really, really matters, okay? No more moderate rivals other than Bloomberg. He's got all the delegates on the line, and Biden sweeps, wins 10 out of 14 states. Bloomberg shut out except for American Samoa, where he picks up a couple delegates, and Sanders only wins 4 out of 14. And from March until now, Biden has been smooth sailing. So that's how that's played out. That's the timeline of events. And I sprinkled in some commentary on my own end and from Twitter. But that's what happened. Let's analyze what happened now. How? Why? Why did this happen? I kind of explained it, but let's go into more detail. What was the Bernie problem? The Bernie problem was that Democratic voters this time around, their biggest concern was who could beat Donald Trump. Consistently across polls, the only Democrats carrying this duality, Biden beat Bernie. Now, this was just perception of electability. Like, this wasn't necessarily to say that Bernie couldn't beat Trump. This was just saying that more Democratic voters thought that Biden could beat Trump than Bernie could beat Trump. The fact that moderates tend to perform better in general elections flipped the traditional script on its head, where progressives and extremists, more extreme wings of the party, tend to do better in primaries. When electability is the biggest concern, you tend to revert back to moderates, right? And the other thing was Bernie ran kind of a flawed campaign. He relied very heavily on youth voter turnout, which is always because the youth just doesn't turn out. Second, he made a better effort to court minorities than in 2016, but it wasn't concerted enough, okay? It just certainly wasn't enough. He didn't do enough voter outreach in the Black community. He did a lot, in the Hispanic community, but all in all, it just wasn't enough. He thought he could circumvent Black voters' loyalty to Joe Biden but he wasn't able to. And finally, big enthusiasm, but a very small base, right? A bigger base than last time, but still a relatively small base. There was no big tent under the party. It was like they had taken the tent of the Democratic Party and split it, right? Where you got the progressives. So Bernie to expand his base. And then, of course, Black Democrat, the key Democrat for Joe Biden, failed to build a coalition. Also, who went well. That Bernie did wrong, Joe Biden capitalized on and really did right. What about the others, though? Why did Warren fail? Why did Pete fail? Why did Klobuchar fail? Well, let's go over some of the major players. Warren and Bernie competed for a very similar ideological ground, which was progressives, but a very different base, okay? Bernie was more the fan of very young, very like Gen Z type, and also like blue collar, low income workers. Bernie was the king of, like union workers, stuff like that. They really like Bernie, right? Warren, on the other hand, was more educated, college educated white professionals. And when you start actually getting into the details of progressive policies like Medicare for all with highly educated white professionals, and they realize that they're going to lose their employer-based health insurance, that doesn't become popular, okay? So Warren lost support as she got more scrutinized, and her base didn't really mesh with her policies, and she had more legwork to do anyway. She had less name recognition than Bernie. They were competing for a similar ideological ground, and her base was less willing to eat up her ideological ideas, and she couldn't expand it. Pete and Klobuchar failed simply just because they could not appeal to people of color while being in the same ideological lane as Biden, right? That's simply put what happened. They could not build a big enough coalition. Bloomberg entered late. You know, he was too centrist. People were calling him a Republican, and he got exposed in the debates. Warren went after. He was absolutely exposed. And some big names didn't even make it. Beto, Kirsten, once again, they really couldn't build a coalition. But unlike Pete and Klobuchar, they didn't even have like a moderate lane to fall back on, because these dudes were like faux progressives, okay? They straddled the line between moderates and progressives and did not even like stand one side on the other. Kamala had like policies on both ends, same with the other two. They had lower name recognition. And in a highly polarized Democratic primary with tribalism tendencies and very polarized policies, that's really an end sign. And just plain bad luck. And most fizzled out early without major support. Most of the people for base page, Yang and Starr stuck around because of Yang's hardcore base and Starr's hardcore spending, right? So let's talk about the Republicans real quick before I dip. Trump just won, but let's be real. The main reason that this is important is because it ties into the Republican primaries other than Trump. So in Congress and the Senate, Trump's influence is still large, okay? Just like a few days ago, Trump's favored nominee for the Alabama Senate race, Tommy Tuberville, beat Jeff Sessions. Even though Jeff Sessions had already served in the Trump administration, just because Trump endorsed Tuberville and said Sessions was dumb, Tuberville swept him, okay? So Trump has massive, massive influence in the Republican Party and in congressional primaries. But as far as the Democratic side goes, the main few reasons: there was a wariness of progressive policies, a coalition of moderates, and the fact that Joe Biden seems to be just as Teflon as Donald Trump. Like, there's not much that damages Biden's support, largely because people are very, very concerned about getting Trump out of office. So that's my spiel. I'll stop sharing the screen, and I'll head over, if Steve will put me there, to the Middle Eastern presentation, and Steve will take it from here.
Sounds good. All right. Let me move you over there. All right, you should be set. Okay, cool. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions? I know Brian was kind of cutting out times, so this would be a good time to like answer some questions if you guys have any. Any at all? No? All right, cool. We're gonna move on then. Can everyone see the screen here?
Yes.
All right, so yeah, basically what Brian left off saying was basically Teflon Don is like a saying that's used for Donald Trump. Like no matter what he does, he'll still have a base. Nothing seems to affect him politically. And Teflon Joe is like seemingly the same thing, but with Joe Biden. All right. Now I thought we'd give a quick talk about the presidential election, right? Things are changing day by day, right? You're seeing the COVID-19 response play a huge part, as Trump would say, in like the presidential election, right? As things start to heat up, more of his base are starting to peel off of like the Republicans. I think it was yesterday I was reading an article on how Democratic leaders are now hoping not only to take the White House, but also it could be pretty easy for them to flip the Senate and like keep the House if they continue to like attack areas that are losing support for the Republican Party and President Trump in general because of his or like lack of response or like lack of proper response to the pandemic. That is something that everyone is not taking very, very well because, it's a big deal. It was a big deal for our safety, and Trump did not really know how to handle it. And it didn't make it any better when like it was all over the news that he like disbanded the emergency response team a couple of years ago that was established under the Obama administration for like the Ebola outbreak. And if you look at the two histories, like in the Obama administration, I think there was like one case of Ebola or like one death in America for Ebola. And people across America were calling for Obama to resign. So, there have been more than just one like death in the COVID-19 pandemic. So like, the political pressure is mounting for Trump, but it seems like his base is still like with him, although it would be reducing in size. But yeah, as things start to heat up more and more, there's different factors playing into it. Of course, there's the economy. Trump, he loves touting the economy and how well the economy is doing under his administration, also explaining like America first, everything like that. But when it seems like America has like the most or like one of the most COVID-19 cases in the world, stuff like that, Americans are starting to get the idea that like it's not necessarily working. And like exiting the WHO, for example, isn't exactly looking good for him. So while Joe Biden's like sitting at home answering like interviews on like YouTube, Trump has the opportunity to like mess things up further, which is like playing an advantage for Joe Biden, which is why many people are arguing if there was like a delay in the election, some sort of thing like that, then it could be like a benefit to President Trump because he could get some recovery time to, bring America back to like a better place. Another thing with elections I wanted to talk about was like very recently we're learning that like primary ballots are oftentimes like now like completely ignored because of like mail-in ballot systems and procedures. So what the problem with mail-in ballots is that they have to be received by the date that the election ballots are due, rather than like posted by then. So people's votes just weren't counted in some of the primaries, and so people are now looking into solutions around that. Okay, so then now it's time for us to talk about Congress, right? We talked about the presidential election. We talked about the primaries leading up to it, what we've seen so far, why Biden versus Trump has happened, why it's going to progress in the way it is, how COVID could affect it. But let's look at Congress specifically, right? So Congress is a very important institution. And it's oftentimes looked over in these presidential elections, but it can really narrow down your analysis onto one race or like one aspect of the election, and it can allow you to like add more nuance into a speech that judges might not know as much about. Like the presidential election is going to become common mainstream news, but these smaller congressional elections that are also important to the parties, if you can draw the importance to that election and you can draw the analysis behind it and really explain it very clearly to the judge, I think you can separate yourself out in a round where we're talking about the presidential election mainly in 2020. All right. So this graphic right here explains like how many seats exactly Democrats have in the House of Representatives, how many seats they have in the Senate, how many Republicans have in each. And so basically what you need to do is remember this stuff to like cite in a speech, right? You don't have to remember it now. You don't have to memorize it now. All you have to do is remember that you will need this information for any congressional speech, right? If the question is asking, can Democrats retain control of the House of Representatives after the 2020 elections, you say in your context, like Democrats have X amount of seats, or like 232 seats, which means that like they have this many seats up for re-election, which means that they need to keep X amount of seats or flip X amount of seats if it's a Senate race, because in the Senate race right now, Democrats have less seats than Republicans, and there are a few toss-ups that they can focus in on, or like not even toss-ups, but other states that we're looking at to see how exactly the election could play out. We'll talk about that later, but does anyone have any questions on like the Senate races and House of Representatives and like including this information in your context? No question? All right, cool. So just like make sure you have like an article or two articles that you can rely on to always have that information, to like see like, you know, to have in your speech that you can cite that source, and no matter what, you know, you have that in your introduction. You don't have to worry about, that's one less source you have to worry about finding. Okay, now let's talk about like answering questions about like congressional elections. So first of all, questions about like general elections or like the election, and then like the congressional election, presidential election will require statistics on popularity. Polling numbers are a great number to use. Like quantifiable data is what you're looking for to show judges like, look, this policy that a politician has is making them popular and it's going to help them in throughout the election. So while that may not be like concrete evidence to show that they will win the election, which is like oftentimes a huge problem that extempers run into, citing polling numbers saying that because their polling numbers are high, they're going to win the election, right? Popularity does not necessarily indicate that people are going to vote for them. For example, in the 2016 presidential election, there was a huge statistical bias around all polls in America, where most people saw like Hillary Clinton winning the election. I think it was like a 76% chance she had of winning, according to Nate Silver, who runs like 538, the website, great website, which like compiles a ton of polls and like sorts them based on like their credibility, and like then takes data from each poll based on how credible they are. Like one poll might weigh more into the final poll they present. So it's a very good source. It's a good source to cite in a speech and like explain what 538 is, like what Nate Silver does. But yeah, they predicted that Hillary would win for like a 70% chance that she would win. Clearly that did not happen. But again, that was because of like polling biases that like people said that they would vote for Clinton because they did not want to admit that they were going to vote for Trump. So that's something to be careful of. Polling does have their like, polling has its caveats, but like it's a very good number to bring into your speech, and definitely use polling numbers in like Senate races and election speeches, because like that's like the bare bones popularity measure for any politician. And then this is like one thing to be aware of. I think Brian mentioned this earlier, but like be careful about like comparisons. And by what I mean by be careful is realize that most times it's going to be asking as a comparison question. With any election speech, right, you're going to have to see like, okay, in this Senate race, if it's asking me who's going to win Kentucky, for example, which we'll talk about later, then you can realize that it's asking you to compare like who you picked the winner as to the person you picked the loser as in each one of your points, right? And I'll get into that in like the Kentucky speech. When we like analyze Kentucky specifically, we can talk about how we can implement this part. Remind me if I forget about that. For Senate and House speeches, be sure you mention the seats that need to be flipped to the institution, like I just mentioned, like using this infographic, stuff like that. Just mention this information. It's important for the judge to understand, right? If you talk about like 3 Senate seats that the Democrats might need to flip in your introduction, then you could talk about 3 Senate races they need to focus on throughout your 3 main points. Or you could talk about key demographics they need to focus on if it's more than just 3 Senate races. And then in your impact, you could talk about, look, Senate races such as the one in North Carolina and Kentucky apply to this scenario because X, Y, and Z. And you'd have to have like state-specific information, which is the next point under here, right? Focus on the area of the election and do not overgeneralize. If there was a Senate race happening in North Carolina, for example, which there is, you do not want to just be like, look, this is happening in Kentucky too, which means it'll happen in North Carolina. Like that makes no logical sense. I want information which would show that people in North Carolina care about a specific issue. And we'll go over that later on. I have a source on that that you can use. And then finally, like if the question asks to like on how a like party should campaign or like what platform it should run on for winning like one specific institution, right? Like the House or the Senate, you want to talk about specific states, as I mentioned in like what I was just saying. In your impact there, you want to have like this state cares about this like issue that should be included in this party's platform. So by including it in the platform, this state could swing towards the party that you're arguing for. Does that make sense? Any questions there? These are like, I'd say like the must-haves for answering any election speeches. All right, we will move on then. So this is called the, does anyone know who Larry Sabato is? Anyone heard that name? No? Okay, cool. So Larry Sabato, I believe, is the director of the Center of Politics at the University of Virginia, and he's oftentimes like a big like name in politics. He wrote a book called The Search Understanding American Politics, and this is his website. It's called Sabato's Crystal Ball. It's on UVA Center for Politics website. So I just wanted to highlight this source. It is an incredible source, and I believe in every single election speech I've cited Sabato's Crystal Ball because, again, it's very, very important. He has new stuff every week. This is like a newsletter I've subscribed to. You can do that here. It's free. So, of course, he talks about the presidential election, and he talks about, like, states in which, that are currently leaning towards one way or the other, which states are toss-ups, which are, like, great indications. And one way to mention that is, like, saying, like, you saying a state is a toss-up is not very credible. And finding evidence showing that it's, like, a toss-up is pretty hard, right? But you could say, like, we've seen a cultural shift in states such as Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida, which is exactly why Larry Sabato, a professor and director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, explains that basically these states are now transferring to become toss-ups, whereas previously they leaned blank, right? So by showing that Larry Sabato thinks they're toss-ups, you have a credible source behind that rather than just yourself. And then, of course, they have like vice presidential rankings because, Biden picking his vice president, which, again, another big comparison question, right? If you get a question like, what would make a good vice presidential pick for Joe Biden? Not only do you have to define what a good vice presidential pick would mean in your introduction and strategically define it for your context, but you'd also have to go on and explain, like, look, if I picked, for example, let's say Kamala Harris. If I pick Kamala Harris, you'd have to explain, like, my first point is because Kamala Harris is seen as Obama 2.0. That is not a great point at all. But you could say, like, in comparison to Tammy Duckworth, for example, Kamala Harris has the edge here. Or, like, you could say the same thing with Elizabeth Warren. You could mention two people in each of your points and say, like, this is where Kamala Harris beats out and becomes a better vice presidential pick for Joe Biden in comparison to Elizabeth Warren and Tammy Duckworth. So that's something to take into account. Make sure you're comparing these things. And as I said, like, comparisons are like the key here. As you can see, like, he has a lot on the presidential races. Senate races, he has every single election that's happening, how they lean, what they're controlled by right now. And so you can see, like, where are like Republican incumbents, where are Democratic incumbents, how is that happening? He even has like governor changes, elections, which, like, I haven't really seen that many questions on, but again, if you get one, you have that. And then House races, which there are a lot more of, obviously, because, every the term there is like 2 years. And so because of that, you can see like how exactly it could play out, who's up for reelection in those specific districts, and you could see like, oh yeah, there's another thing that you could see here. I don't know why this tab keeps popping up, but you could see like Republicans who are running for reelection in like hit Clinton districts and like Democrats in Trump districts. Those are always key to bring up, right? Because one point that you could always talk about is like Democrats and especially Senate elections need to like support Democrats running in Trump districts, and then you like Trump states, like states that went to Trump in 2016. And you can explain why that's significant. And Sabato's Crystal Ball makes it so easy to have that one website with you that'll like let you have that. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, cool. For just like to go over that, if you want to search like or like get to the website, just search up Sabato's Crystal Ball and it should be the first result. This is a link about what states care about. As I said, like I have a few slides on like state issues because I talked about like 2 slides ago rather here. I think you need to include like state specific information and so what they're doing or what they care about. And so like here you have a good like infographic about what's going on, what states care about the most. And so like the Pew Research Center is not only a very credible source, but you can get state specific information as to what's happening, and then target your speech around that, right? You could say that parties need to organize a platform and campaign around these issues, because if they address these issues and provide adequate solutions to them, they will increase their voter turnout and ultimately win the election if they do so. Again, you're going to have some logical reasoning behind that, but just make sure you can have that. I can send these links in the chat if you guys want that afterwards, but in the interest of time, I'll just continue to move on. All right, this is, does anyone know who this is? Should be pretty obvious. He should be a familiar face. Very often mentioned in Extemp.
Shrek.
Yeah, this is Shrek. Good job. You got that. He has a turtle, right? So like, I was gonna say turtle, but yeah, Shrek, turtle. Any other guesses as to who this is?
King Boo from Mario Kart.
All right, cool. I think we've had some interesting ones. I honestly had not heard of the King Boo one. I've heard of Shrek and Turtle, but very creative. This is Mitch McConnell. He is a big proponent of no progress, I guess. So like a opponent of progress would be a better term to put it. I think he has something like, honestly, I think it was something like 500 bills or like 150, might be 150. But like he has lots of bills just sitting on his desk that have gone through the House and stuff like that, that he has just not, decided to be heard in the chamber, the Senate chamber, because he has the complete power as like what gets heard in the Senate as the Senate Majority Leader. The issue here is two things, right? Mitch McConnell is, no one likes him, right? To put it plainly, he's a little bit of like an asshole. So just be aware of that. Basically, yeah, he isn't exactly the most productive person either. So he's created a lot of rivals across like all parties, and popularity among Republicans is also shrinking. One specific thing is the Equal Rights Amendment, which is for like women's rights, because we'll talk about this more in like the social issues lecture later on today. But yeah, Mitch McConnell is just not listening to that, even though Virginia ratified that and was like the last state that needed to ratify it in order for it to be heard, passed, and become an amendment. So there's that. All right, moving on to his actual election, right? So the Senate election that he's going to be in is in Kentucky, which is where he's from, and he's probably going to go up against Amy McGrath, right? The Democrat candidate that's most likely to be going to become like the nominee for like the Senate election there. Although like she has her own issues, right? So let's go through this election and we'll look at like a thought process as to why or how to tackle these Senate speeches, right? So the question might be like, who will win Kentucky Senate election in 2020? What you want to notice is Mitch McConnell is historically unpopular. More people disapprove of him right now than approve of him, which isn't exactly a great look. And then something he does have, on the other hand, though, is Trump's endorsement. Kentucky was a Trump state in 2016, and support for President Trump in that state is pretty high. So what that means is Trump's endorsement could help McConnell because people support Trump, but in Kentucky, people don't necessarily support McConnell like without Trump, which is weird. And then what else McConnell has is name recognition, right? When you look at the primaries, what Brian highlighted is like there were 27 candidates to become like the nominee for the election, but the two that ended up being the most relevant were Sanders and Biden. And those were the two we already knew. So like if you think about name recognition, it plays a huge role in American politics, right? For example, like Hillary Clinton, like everyone knew who she was and stuff like that, like because of Bill Clinton and whatnot, and because of her roles as like senator. And she has had like an active role in politics throughout. So like she had multiple roles to be known by, whereas, you know, Amy McGrath is a relatively new politician. Mitch McConnell having that like name recognition by being the Senate Majority Leader, it really gives him an advantage here because everyone across the state knows who he is. However, like despite Mitch McConnell being historically unpopular, because of this name recognition and President Trump's endorsement, he is in a better spot to win Kentucky's election, right? Amy McGrath right now has a lot of support and fundraising, and this is why everyone's concerned about Kentucky's Senate race. But what she has done is run a confusing campaign. Anant likes to put it as saying that like Amy McGrath is trying to out-conservative the most conservative like senator in the country, arguably, Mitch McConnell, even though she's a Democrat. What she said in her campaign was that she wants to make sure that no one obstructs President Trump's agenda. And she's saying like Mitch McConnell isn't doing an effective enough job of, you know, making sure Trump's agenda gets passed. And so that's what she'll do, which is weird because she's alienating her progressive and Democratic base by saying she's going to support those Republican and Trump policies. Whereas on the other hand, she's showing Republicans that she wants to be more conservative than Mitch McConnell, which is very confusing. So that has led to her flipping policies and views, and no one wants an inconsistent candidate rather, and wants to see consistency in a politician that they need to trust. What this does is angering her base and her Republicans, as we talked about. But an interesting thought here is there can be a strategic balance as to what happens with the election in Kentucky to help the Democrats overall, right? Amy McGrath might not win the election, but she could still help the Democratic Party. Could anyone think as to why the Democrats would be benefited if Amy McGrath didn't necessarily win the election? Any thoughts there?
If it were close enough, there's a chance that the party would kind of block Mitch McConnell from becoming the majority leader again.
Right. So not necessarily like Mitch McConnell's chances of becoming Senate majority leader, but it's more so if the Republicans are so concerned about Kentucky's Senate race, then they'll invest heavily into the Kentucky Senate race. And then becoming worried about so Caitlin in the chat said it puts up enough of a fight to strain Republican resources and money. That's basically what I'm hinting at here, right? If people are worried about the Senate majority leader, the leader of the Republicans right now, along with President Trump, losing their election, they're going to make sure that they invest there because that's a really bad look for the party. That means that they have strained resources, less resources allocated towards like other states and other elections, whereas Democrats can invest more heavily there in order to try to win those toss-ups in key states that have Democrats running in Trump states, for example. Does anyone have any questions there? Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is like in a speech where you're asked like the question, who would win Kentucky Senate election? And let's say, for example, you argue Mitch McConnell because he has Trump's endorsement in your first point. You could say, as opposed to Amy McGrath, who doesn't have Trump's endorsement, which plays a huge role in Kentucky, right? You really want to make that comparison. That wasn't exactly logical. That wasn't backed up with evidence, but you want to do that and explain why, in comparison to Amy McGrath, Mitch McConnell is winning the election, right? It's very easy to just look at one side of things and say Mitch McConnell is going to win because he has this, because he has this, and because he has this. But addressing the opposition is what really makes that extemp speech go a step further, and it draws that comparison which is being asked of you in the first place. All right, and then lastly, we only have a couple minutes, so I wanted to end on a quick discussion around after Pelosi. I've seen a few questions raised around whether or not Pelosi should be replaced as the Speaker of the House and who will replace her. Now, one person that has been suggested as a potential speaker is AOC. Now, does anyone see any problems with that?
She's like kind of far, like really far to the left. So I feel like a moderate might be more strategic.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge part of it, right? She's very, very progressive, and so like that's a problem because the speaker should be like binding the Democratic Party together. And then the other thing is what is brought up by Caitlin is that AOC is very, very young, right? She's very new onto like the congressional scene, and the Speaker of the House typically needs to be like a more experienced member. So EOC is probably like knocked out of the equation there. And depending on whether or not the Democrats retain control of the House, we will have to see what happens to Pelosi. But many are predicting that Pelosi will stay the Speaker of the House. So that's just a discussion I wanted to have, just because I know this is an issue that's being discussed. And other than that, that's all I had to go through. So now we will take some time for questions.